Good afternoon and welcome to Orkney International Science Festival 2021 online in this year of Scotland's coasts and waters. My name is Eric Walker and it's my pleasure to be hosting this session. Our speaker today is Professor Iain MacLeod. Iain's first degree was in civil engineering. After graduating from the University of Glasgow, he worked on the design of heavy engineering structures. Later, he worked in Vancouver, Canada, on the design of pulp and paper mills. He went on to lecture at Glasgow University and at Paisley College of Technology, and up to his retirement in 2004, he was Professor of Structural Engineering at the University of Strathclyde. He is very active in retirement and is interested in ways in which organisational structures can help with the problems of society. Today, Iain asks whether public bodies can cope with the biggest challenges of today. He provides examples of organisations which demonstrate success and others where learning is most definitely needed. There are success factors required, which will be obvious to many of us, and Iain will show that the additional factor of critical thinking is also crucial. I want to encourage you all to take part in this event and ask you to please enter your comments and questions in YouTube's live chat, and I'll present them to Iain after his talk. Iain, over to you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very pleased to be talking to you here again. This is the fourth time that I've spoken to at the Orkney Science Festival. It's always been on the same subject, but I think I've got a different slant about it this afternoon. So fundamentally, a critical issue in society is how success is achieved in situations of complex uncertainty. By complex uncertainty, I mean situations where, for example, the goals are unclear and in competition with each other, and there may be, or very normally, are unintended consequences that are likely to emerge. I'm talking about decisions in high-risk situations. Excuse me. No, got a problem. Here we go. So when you make decisions, how do you go about it? Well, the normal situation is that you don't have rules to get to the answer. You have to start with a proposal and see if it'll work. And there are two ways you can go about that. You can say, you can accept the proposal only if thorough testing shows it to be acceptable. And this requires critical thinking, which is essential in high-risk situations. And alternatively, you can accept it on the basis of intuition. This is very common. You just say, oh, we'll just go for it without testing it. Now here, I'm going to introduce you to a new word. I'm calling this squelching. So squelching is, the verb means to make a decision based on a proposal that has not been adequately tested. So you won't have heard of this word before because I've coined it myself, and this is the first time that I've used it in a public situation. So I'm interested in your reaction to it as to whether it be useful or not. There's a good word. So fundamentally, government decision-making is structured for squelching. That's what I'm going to explain to you. This is Rory Stewart. He, if you remember, put himself up for the leadership of the Conservative Party. He was a minister in the government, but when he did very well in the leadership, but he didn't get it, of course, and he couldn't face up to working with Boris Johnson, so he left the government, which is rather a pity. This is I'm going to give you a quote from this article from the Times Literary Supplement, which I think is very good. Here's the quote. Governing was about critical thinking. Politics was not. While critical thinking demanded humility, British politics demanded absolute confidence. In place of reality, it offered untethered hope. Instead of accuracy, vagueness. While critical thinking required skepticism, open-mindedness, and an instinct for complexity, politics demanded loyalty, partisanship, and slogans, not truth and reason, but power and persuasion. I've highlighted these words about critical thinking, which I think represent a good summary of many of the features of critical thinking. So, what exactly is it? The Wikipedia definition is good. They say it's the analysis of facts to form a judgment. And you could also say that critical thinking is the ethos of complex problem solving, where ethos is the principles that guide your actions, how you think. And I say that how you think is as important as what you can do in trying to create successful outcomes. Now, if you're going to test a proposal, how should you go about it? It's not a simple thing, because you should test it to the limits of its potential. You want to have a holistic view, address all the requirements, and in that way you will address the complexity. And you want to test it against other proposals. You don't just want to do one proposal. You want to find the best proposal, so you need to do options analysis. And you want to use the most appropriate testing methods that are available in the context. For example, if there are predictive models that you can use, you want to use that. And you don't want to be doing it by yourself. You want to have a multidisciplinary team, because if it's complex, it's unlikely that just one person has the skill to cover all the issues. And you want to be open-minded and skeptical, as Rory Stewart advised. You don't want to rely on intuition. You use your intuition, and you want to avoid bias. And I'm going to talk about bias shortly. And you want to use reliable evidence and reason to the limits of their potential. So, a case study. And the first one is the UK COVID vaccine task force. Now, what I'm going to do is got some quotes from the Times, an article in the Times earlier this year, which gives a very good summary of how that vaccine task force went about its business. So what happened was that this woman, Nettie England, was contacted by the Oxford University team to try to set up a group to help to promote the vaccine. She was a manufacturing expert at Bioindustry Association. And by Monday evening, she said, we had a consortium which was made up of companies that in normal times would be competitors, i.e. the very good collaboration. The task force pooled in industry and scientific experts, disciplinary competence, and the chairwoman was Kate Bingham. Now, you might think that this is not a very good idea. She's a good friend of Boris. This is just another friend of Boris's. But actually, she turned out to be very, very good, had the right background for it, and had a very good democratic leadership style. The task force whittled down a short list of 23 vaccines. And they were testing the solution. They were doing options analysis. And they were saying the minister likes the look of Moderna, but the task force is adamant that the BioNTech would be ready first. Now, this is a really important issue. And in this particular case, the minister did exactly the right thing. And I'll come back to this issue later. And the unit's success can be attributed in large part to the fact it was run by a small, tightly knit group of people who knew each other, knew what they wanted, and knew how to go about getting it. So they had competence, collaboration, trust. So these are some of the features that they used for the task force. So they used a critical thinking approach, It wasn't just critical thinking. A number of other issues, features had to be in place. So here I'm set out what I'm calling a framework for critical thinking. The foundation features are critical thinking, democratic leadership, and disciplinary competence. And on top of that, you've got collaboration, commitment, wise governance, and professional integrity. So that's basically the model I'm using to say how you go about addressing complex uncertainty. So now let me look at how decisions are made within government. So first of all, ministerial decisions. What happens is that there are advisors and civil servants, maybe lots and lots of advisors and maybe lots of civil servants. But what happens is that the ministers formulate the proposals. They listen to advice and then they make up their mind what should be done and they decide. Now, what I'm calling an engineered decision-making strategy, or you might call it critical thinking strategy, in addition to the advisors, you've got a task force, just like the vaccine task force. And here is the big difference. The task force formulate the proposals. But the ministers still decide. They make a proposal to the minister who then decides. But what can't be allowed is that the minister is not allowed to say to the task force, oh, I don't like what you're doing. I've got a better way. We'll just do it my way. The minister wants something else, has a better idea. They say to the task force, hey, how about this idea? How about please test that out and see if it against what you've done and let me know. So the real problem is that government ministers have too much executive power. They get away with murder because they're not required to test their proposals. And I'll develop that shortly. So what we have is the decision-making style, a ministerial and an engineered style. So the minister tend to squilt. We don't always squilt, but they're normally not testing their proposals properly. And they're autocratic. The system allows them, encourages them to be autocratic, to make their own decisions without having them properly tested. And because they're squelching, and they're not prepared to test the proposals, they can't really be committed to the goals. And because they're not, because they're autocratic, they're not collaborative. Then they're not. Have you ever heard on the radio or television a minister talking in the first person plural? They always say I decided, but it really should be we. So autocratic leaders make their own proposals, but democratic leaders seek consensus for the team. And there's sometimes autocratic leaders do well, but it's too much high risk to be autocratic, because you want to take advantage of the team and the wide expertise in the multidisciplinary way. So the ministerial approach is a really high risk strategy. And whereas James Bond was licensed to kill, government ministers are licensed to squelch. There's no comeback on them after they make their decisions. So let me talk now about risk in getting advice. You need to be very careful about getting advice. So people tend to give advice that favors their livelihood rather than the public good. For example, if you're selling an idea or a product, you have to be optimistic. Markets don't address public good issues. If your job as a politician is to address the public good, and you're getting advice from people whose first objective is to make sure their business goes well and not the public good, then you need to be very careful about that advice. It doesn't mean to say you shouldn't listen to it, but you should need to be careful about it. Also, people like to be told what they want to hear. We all have that problem. And particularly autocratic leaders don't like to be challenged. Anyone who challenges them, their autocratic leader, probably best to finish their challenge by saying, I resign. And consultants have problems with giving advice, in that they want to keep their client happy. And you keep the client happy by telling your client what your client wants to hear. So there are real problems with advice. And when you're doing critical thinking, you're seeking the truth. You're very wary of all advice, focusing on the goals, putting aside preconceptions and personal interests. Now, I'm not saying you don't take advice. Very, very important to get advice. You just want to be careful and not believe it in every case. Okay, another case study. You might say, well, what's the Royal National Lifeboat Institution got to do with government decision making? But there's some interesting features here that I'll explain to you. A bit less than 15 years ago, the RNLI failed to find a boatyard to build boats to their specification. They wanted to improve the quality and bring the cost down. And they had ideas how they might go about doing that, but they couldn't get a boatyard in the UK to join up with them. So what they did, they set up their own boat building and repair facility. So what they have is a system like this. They've got a board of governors and they've got an executive team, and they oversee the whole of the operations. It's called vertically integrated operation. They do the operations, the fundraising, the boat building and repair, and the training. And in the 2019 report of the RNLI, the CEO, Mark Dowie, said this: "We are one crew, we are all lifesavers, and we are all fundraisers. Everyone is valuable, and we are all working together towards a shared goal of saving as many people from drowning as possible." So this is a really good concept, a one crew concept that the RNLI have. It's a very successful organization based on the features of the framework, and they're not in competition with any other body. And this is a very interesting thing. Some people think that in order to do well, you have to be in competition, but it's absolutely not true. The RNLI are not in competition, and often governments do things well despite not having competition. But whatever the situation is, you need to have critical thinking. You need to use the critical thinking framework. So that leads me on to the RNLI is a lead on to this situation in Scotland just now. The Caledonian MacBrayne is not just the Scottish ferry system. There are lots of other ferries, but it's the Caledonian MacBrayne system that we're talking about. And that's owned by the Scottish government. And there are two independent groups, the CMAL, Caledonian Marine Assets Limited, that deal with the assets. And there's Calmark Ferries that deal with the operation. And then Ferguson Marine got a contract in 2015 to build two ferries, but the contract failed dismally. Now, the ferry system has serious problems. They definitely don't have a one crew ethos at the contract with Ferguson's, and the plans for replacement vessels are in disarray. So what should be done? Well, I think they should use the RNLI model, one crew, set up a one crew ethos, and use the critical thinking framework in order to. But the one thing that in order to do that, they have to prevent. They have to have arrangement. The rules of engagement have to be that the government is not allowed to squelch. They're not. Every proposal has to be tested using critical thinking. So what happens is that what needs to be that the ministers need to think of themselves as part of the crew. that they're part of the strong drive to get everything right. And they need to talk, as I say, in the first person plural and not in the first person singular. So they can contribute to the ideas, but not use their executive power to change things if it's not been tested. So my final case study is the electricity system, which is part of the energy. And I'm just using one particular feature here. And so in November 2020, Prime Minister Boris Johnson outlined his 10-point plan for a green industrial revolution. Now note that this is his plan. It's Boris Johnson's plan, not some group of people's plan. And his point one was that producing enough offshore wind to power every home, quadrupling how much we produce to 40 gigawatts by 2030, and supporting up to 60,000 jobs. Well, this proposal is based on the following principle, that the way forward towards net zero is to build up the wind and solar fleets and to promote the closure of coal and gas generators. The cost of doing this will be acceptable. So that's the proposal. And if we use our critical thinking approach, we say, well, let's test it. It needs to be tested, badly needs to be tested. So that's what I'm going to do with you just now. I'm going to show you how it might be tested. This is the output from the electricity system on the 14th of May, just before 6 o'clock. The demand was 35 gigawatts, which is average for the UK demand. Now look what's happening here. The nuclear is doing its stuff. The main generator is gas. CCGT stands for combined cycle gas turbines. That's what it was producing 19 of the 35 gigawatts. And biomass was churning away at 3 gigawatts. That's maximum capacity. The coal was doing 1 gigawatt, but the wind was doing 0.6 of a gigawatt. And the installed capacity for the wind at that time was 24 gigawatts. So it's just producing a very small fraction of its capacity. So it was not doing well. Further down, you see a wee bit of hydro, and you see interconnectors from France was helping to to meet the demand. Now, suppose you say, well, okay, it's just a matter of having more wind. So supposing we adopted Boris Johnson's suggestion that we want 40 gigawatts. So that would give you a total of, so you multiply by a factor of 4, that would give you 2.4 gigawatts. And suppose you might do it by a factor of 10, that would give you 6 times 0.6 is 6 gigawatts. You're nowhere near meeting the demand of reducing the gas generation down to zero. And it doesn't matter how much wind you put in, you'd find it difficult to do that. Now, you may say to me, that's pretty poor sciencey, and you're making a statement on the basis of only one item of data. But in fact, this single chart here tells us a lot. But actually, it's not an unusual situation. Here is the generation during April this year, and you can see that the cyan color is wind, same colors as in the previous slide. Brown is gas. And so at the beginning of this week, we were getting really good wind. It was nearly pushing the gas right out, which is just what you want. But then towards the end of the week, it started to get less. And this week here, look at that, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. that whole week, there was very little wind, and the same at the beginning of the next week. In fact, there wasn't much wind at all. This good wind didn't reoccur in that month. It hasn't been very good since that time. So that situation has to be taken into account in the planning. In principle, closing down coal and gas generators is a good idea, but when the wind is not blowing and the sun is not shining, other forms of generation must be available. And you don't need to be an experienced critical thinker to work that one out. Meeting demand is not the only problem in closing down these generators. They have other functions in the system, particularly for operational issues, such as reactive power for voltage control, synchronicity for frequency control, inertia for fault recovery, and black start recovery. Now, these are highly technical issues. I don't fully understand them myself, but they need to be addressed, just like all the others. So I need to ask the question, why are we in this situation? Well, there's no doubt about it. Proposals are not being fully tested. Studies that are being used tend not to address all the issues. And in particular, cost is not being reliably estimated, if at all. The cost of doing these things is critically important. Even if you say you have to go ahead with it anyway, you want to know what it's going to be so that you can take steps to decide how you're going to finance it. So not addressing the cost is high-level squelching, heavy squelching. And targets have been set in the absence of feasible plans to achieve them. That's a crazy idea if you think about it. What's the point of having a target if you don't know how you're going to, if you haven't a plan that you know you have a good chance of it working? But that's what goes on all the time. And finally, there's no engineered plan. Very little critical thinking going on in order to try to, in the whole way that the energy, the changes, the very critical need for changes in how we provide energy needs to be addressed. So what needs to be done? Well, you need to create a national task force for energy. We're calling it a National Energy Authority. And then that needs to use the critical thinking framework. So now people say, oh, but that won't work. Your National Energy Authority, it can't, that wouldn't work, they say. But it can work, and we've very, very good evidence that it can work, because in 1926, the Electricity Act, an Electricity Act passed by a conservative Stanley Baldwin's government, set in train a system where electricity commissioners were appointed to design the system and the electricity system, and another group was set up to implement their designs, and it worked extremely well. Between 1926 and 1960, the price in real terms of electricity went down by a factor of 3.5. It was a great, very successful, and we know it can happen, and that's what it should be. However, critical thinking, electricity production is just one of the energy issues, and these other energy issues, it seems to me, are just being as badly done. And I think that unless critical thinking is adopted in government for planning for energy, there's no prospect of significant reduction in CO2 emissions, because if you're not using the critical thinking framework, it's very likely that you're going to get it wrong. And that for example, if we don't make sure that the electricity system can supply electricity at all times, it's an iron rule of the system that there must be enough generation there to meet demand at all times, then it's going to be seriously negative for the people. For example, if there is a blackout, there's predictions are that it could last for quite a long time, and maybe that might focus those that make the decisions on doing it better. But it's irrational to wait for that to happen, because we definitely know how to do it. So we look at critical thinking versus squelching. Critical thinking is well used in many enterprises. It's used in engineering, business, science, medicine, law, etc. And it is used in government in some situations also very successfully. A lot of people work in total quality management. And that is thinking very hard about how you go about your business and trying to get it right. Whereas squelching, it's pervasive in government because it's built into the system, because ministers are, as I say, are allowed to squelch. And it's very common in human affairs because people are not educated to be critical thinkers on the whole. Some are, but on the whole it's not, and they should be. So we all need to develop a critical thinking ethos and to develop a healthy skepticism about proposals for action and be open-minded about solutions, as Rory suggested. And for example, many people say no to nuclear. But the critical thinking approach is that to have all options on the table and only discard nuclear if it fails in rigorous testing of the options, that's the way to go about your business. So fundamentally, the ethos of an organization is greatly influenced by that of the leader. Set, you would say, not just more than greatly influenced, set by that of the leader. And I think there's a great opportunity for a political leader to adopt critical thinking in government decision-making. It would make a huge change to the success of government decisions. And I asked the question, what would have happened had Rory Stewart become leader of the Conservatives? I certainly would have voted for him if I had had a vote when he was bidding for that. So there we are. That's the end of my talk. Thank you very much.
Well, Iain, thank you very much for that very thought-provoking talk. You've introduced a new word, squelch, and squelching, and squelching, and you've used it liberally, and you've used it. It actually feels like a word that already existed. That's how good it was in that presentation. And I have to say, I was analysing myself, because that's the kind of natural thing humans do. Am I a squelcher or am I a critical thinker? And I've got plenty of examples where I have been a critical thinker or involved in good critical thinking teams. But if I wear my heart on my sleeve, I've been a squelcher as well. You know, you can swap between both camps. It's just, you know, I don't know. It must be the way we're brought up.
Absolutely, we're all squelchers as well as critical thinkers.
There was, from your diagrams and examples, I've got critical thinking is an essential skill, but it needs the appropriate system, the model, and the cultural environment to be in place to work properly. If I've read you right, Iain.
Absolutely, yes.
Then there was plenty of examples you had there. There was a comment come in with critical thinking would require politicians to have humility and an acceptance that they can be wrong. Most of them struggle with those. Now, I'm going to expand that because I have observed that also in business executives, business leaders, business managers. I've observed it even at small local club level. You know, why do people struggle with this, the humility and the acceptance that they can be wrong?
Well, some people are just like that. These people, like the autocratic managers, they like to they like to manage. One of their objectives in life is to get into a situation where they can be, where they can just command other people, where they can be autocratic. And these people must not be, you must try to, when you're appointing people, you want to try to avoid appointing these people. It can be difficult because they can often sound impressive. And they go to an interview, they do well at an interview, they say, oh, there's a good person here. But once they get into place, you find that they're not good at all. They think that they know everything and they don't. Whereas the people that can do it often are not the people you would think. And we see this in engineering. Some of the good managers are very quiet people, and they're very, very self-effacing. They're not pushy, but they've got steel behind them, and they can do really well. And I think Rory, I suspect Rory Stewart might be in that category. I don't know how good a leader he might be, although he's a very good experience in doing that, in governing in Iraq. But you need to get the right person, and it's the people who you think might be good, you want to be very wary of them.
Yeah, I can think of many of my real life working examples where the people that were rewarded well, you were encouraged to make decisions quickly and get them done, you know. Mm-hmm. And you've heard that very recently, certainly in the political environment. However, there was the other end of the continuum where you had people who they were good thinkers, but they often, you ended up with, and I'm sure you've heard this phrase before, they didn't make decisions, and it was almost like paralysis by analysis. It's almost the other, the counter end of that continuum. There must be somewhere in between that's the right place.
Yes, well, this is again where the team can work really well. So you've got some people that are like to get deeply into the thing, and others people stand back and take a wider view. And the good leader can put these people together and try to come to a good balance in doing things. So balance is one of the critical features of getting it right.
Yeah, you've possibly identified observed this before. It's what I call during generational changes within organizations, where the new guard is in the stages of replacing the old guard. I've often seen changes made almost for change's sake, where some of the good old stuff just gets thrown out so that the new guard comes in, they have said they're doing something, just almost for change's sake. And it's very disheartening when you've seen it, especially when it's happened to yourself. You've worked all your career for something,
Yeah, that is a big problem when the new broom comes in, wants to get executive power, and they want to wield that executive power, and often can bring things in that make it worse.
Yeah,
don't improve it at all.
There's various stages where the critical thinking is appropriate, and the diagnostic stage of where is my organization at now and where should it go. You need the critical thinking for that at that point as well, don't you?
Absolutely.
Yeah. There's actually a good question here is from Rich. Does Iain think that the HST 125 British Rail project that was developed in the late 70s and was successful used critical thinking? And also, was this why the tilting train project failed at pretty much the same time?
Would you repeat that again, please?
So do you think that the HST 125 British Rail project that was developed in the late 70s and was successful, did it use critical thinking? And was this why the tilting train project failed at the same time?
What was the second project?
The tilting train project. Remember?
Tilting crane. I'm not very sure what the tilting crane project is, but if you talk about these big civil engineering projects, well, these are very well organized. A few of them go wrong, but not many. And there's no doubt that critical thinking, and by the way, critical thinking, good engineering are synonymous in my view. That the way they go about and the way they think about it and they plan it, these are very complex projects, and normally they're extremely successful. And you hear about some, you say, oh, it's not very good but these are the unusual ones. And but here is the thing: it doesn't matter how hard you try and you use the framework and critical thinking and all the ideas, doesn't guarantee that you're going to be successful, because you can always miss something, and something can happen that you couldn't predict or and then it happens. So what the critical thinking does, and all these other strategies, they reduce the risk. So engineering is mainly about reducing risk in these big projects. And so if you're focusing on how to reduce the risk, then you're a good chance of getting it right, but it doesn't guarantee it.
No. But you get it less wrong, and it's probably more manageable to overcome it.
Yeah.
Your wind generation analysis was actually very enlightening, I would say, Ian. And, fundamentally, we all know that wind power is it's not predictable. Even in this, it's just not predictable. However, tidal energy, it's extremely predictable and reliable, as is, nuclear energy. Could either of those be used for a base load cover? And I'm just, an outsider looking in, and it just kind of seems obvious.
Well, so taking tidal power, there's a lack of resource worldwide for that. So, and it's expensive. So it's worth experimenting with it and see if I can take it. But it doesn't seem to me that it has the potential to scale up.
Yeah, this is the kind of the cost element you were talking about earlier.
Yeah. Yes. But nuclear most certainly does have can scale up, and it has been scaled up. France runs its electricity system on nuclear. And there are very interesting developments in nuclear. There's a British firm called Moltex who have designed what's called a molten salt reactor for the province of New Brunswick in Canada. And their technology does not have a high pressure problem with it. And if it works, and it seems a good chance it will work, it will be much safer and much cheaper than the present system. It needs to be tested, and it is being tested in Canada. And I think it's a very promising thing. So all these ideas should be, as I say, should be on the table. We shouldn't discard any of them, test them as far as they'll take it, and then decide what's the best way to spend your money.
Yeah.
Test on the basis of good costing. Yes.
Test, evaluate, and then redesign or whatever. That's just keep doing that cycle until you get it nearly right. Yeah.
Yes.
Here's another question, very apt to today. Is critical thinking being used in the development of the motor industry? And what seems to be the accelerated advancement of electric cars over hydrogen or any other fuel?
Yes, well, the answer to the question is almost certainly. There's lots of really good design ideas. It's a very hard, very difficult thing to do, to design a car that's a battery-driven car that's going to run a distance that's going to be reasonably affordable. It's not easy. And I would say all these projects are a lot of really, really good engineering goes into it, which, as I say, it's equivalent to critical thinking. But what the problem is to decide what should the government do about that, and just saying, oh, we'll close, we won't be allowed to have any internal combustion engines by such and such a date, without working out what the consequence of that would be. That's not the way to go about your business, is it?
Yeah. There's a response.
Yes.
Sculpting, yes, sculpting, yeah. There's a response come into your answer about the tidal power when it's surely as more development takes place, the price of tidal will decline like the rest of technological development. I suppose that has to be tested. Yeah.
Well, yes, that of course is likely to happen, but you're doing something very difficult. They say that when the UK is not surrounded by water, but a dilute solution of a very corrosive liquid. So you're putting stuff down there into a very, let's take the Pentland Firth. it's a very hostile environment down there, not just because it's salt water, but because there's, you know, very turbulent situation. And so, and that if you, where the good tides are, is where you have these difficulties. It's not an easy problem at all. And yes, absolutely, it will come down, but it doesn't seem to me, but I might be wrong, and if we should continue to experiment with it, it's unlikely that worldwide it will provide a significant contribution to the gap that I showed between the renewable energy and the fossil fuel energy.
And this is one last question. The numbers don't have to be exact. It's got critical thinkers, the good people, right, that are put off from applying for, you know, leadership jobs by the 5% of stuff they don't know, whereas autocratic types of leader often apply knowing only 5% in the first place. How appropriate is that?
That's good. Yes, I like that.
Yeah, I like that. I think I'm going to end it there, Iain, because as usual, we have come to, we've used up our time, and very, 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 very good, good talk. Can I just thank the audience for actively taking part? There was a lot of good questions and comments coming in there. You obviously stimulated people into thought there, Iain. And could I ask the audience to complete a feedback form for us here in the festival? There's a link to it in the YouTube description box below. And thank you for doing that in advance, because it helps so much for us to shape things in the future. Helps us with our critical thinking. Iain, can I thank you so much for that fascinating and stimulating talk? And I'd like to suggest that the Science Festival Technical and Presentation Support Team is a good example of successful critical thinking team, which fits many of your key criteria and models. And we overcame the problems that were thumped onto us, you know, with the COVID situation, and we've ended up with a successful outcome. Yeah,
that's right, Eric. Critical thinking is actually quite common. We just need to get it in the right places.
In the right places, that's fine. Iain, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Enjoyed talking.
The next event in the programme is A Wealth of Weeds at 5 p.m, which enlightens us as to how garden weeds can be a source of nutrition and fresh flavour for the garden, and also how it enriches the soil. If you're enjoying the festival, please consider donating. Full details of how to do so are also in the YouTube description box. And don't forget to like us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and follow this YouTube channel. Remember, the Festival Club will be open this evening at 9:30, where you have a chance to talk further with some of the speakers for today and also other viewers. That's it for just now. Thank you and goodbye.